Morning, everyone. Basically, this topic is part of some of its content came from a TRB presentation that we had. We're going to be presenting a case study around wet processing of a couple of different types of recycled polyethylene with Elboy RET. Basically, a lot of the folks, in the audience may have seen some of this. This is a little bit less technical than the TRB, but if there's any questions, feel free to reach out, afterwards. We can share the TRB deck and go from there with some of the other technical information we've been looking at. But just to start out, we heard in the training session, we heard yesterday around with the DOT government update that this is a hot topic. We have a huge problem with the plastics we're using, regardless of the type of plastic, in that it's a problem. This got teed up a couple years ago where most of the first world recycled materials, your blue bins, were being sent to China or India for processing. And because those countries have built up their infrastructure to start recycling, they didn't need, for what they were using for their products, any of the recycled material from the US and Europe. So because of that, now there's a huge surplus here in the US. And amazingly, from my perspective, this has got huge bipartisan support. Both sides of both political parties are aligned. They're both introducing bills. You may not have heard, but just 2 years ago with the federal highway bill that's still being worked on, the word mandate was put in. And as an industry, we don't like hearing that word, especially when the science isn't settled yet. But it's really gotten the attention of I think everyone. And so just even what's been recent and this past December, there's a bipartisan congressional task force that got initiated. You just mentioned the highway bill. There's the Save Our Seas bill that also had the word mandate in it. Both the highway bill and the Save Our Seas bill have been walked back to have research to explore the topic. There's been these two other acts that have gone through, the Recover and the Recycle, which has been to both help increase the infrastructure for recycling, because our recycle rates are very, very low compared to other developed nations. I think we're like 14% of any material is recycled. So because of that, a lot of the more rural or local areas, aren't recycling. I know when I was living in East Texas a couple years ago, we didn't have a recycle bin. Now that I'm outside Houston, our recycle bin's bigger than our trash can. But we know that AI, NAPA, AASHTO, others have working groups. We're here today to hear about this. We had a training session in the workshop on Tuesday. So this is really kind of running away, and we need to really wrap our arms around this and stay ahead so that we can be key influencers. So I just want to really highlight, not every plastic is created equal. From a chemistry perspective, there are many different types. They're all tailored to meet specific properties. So your water bottle, for example, is polyethylene terephthalate, and that is a typically highly recycled plastic. It's either this year or next year, I believe, all of the major soft drink and water companies are moving to a completely recycled bottle. So this is very highly recycled, which is great. And all of these have recycle codes. So there's 7 major recycle codes. High density polyethylene has a recycle code 2. It's your milk jug or anything that's a rigid type application, detergent bottles, potentially your orange juice bottle, pill bottles. This is another highly recycled material that does go through and get reused at high level. PVC's got a 3. This is your water pipes, potentially a plastic conduit. This is typically recycled very highly in Europe, not so much here in the US. Some potential issues with it are once you start heating it to reprocess it, it will off-gas. So that's something just to be aware of. Low-density polyethylene typically are from film applications, either food packaging where it could be multi-layer, And in some, this is basically to extend the freshness of your food. So your steak stays red longer without adding nitrites. Your vegetables stay fresher longer. Really, it's very critical with this multi-layer packaging in order to improve shelf life of food. Because of that, it typically is not recycled because you may have other polymers in there. It's not a pure polyethylene. Also, typically any of your condiment bottles that are squeezable, anything with like a soft touch, that'll be a low density or a linear low density polyethylene. Polypropylene's used in quite a bit. Probably the most thing people will see is if it's like your candy box, the lid, it's got a flexible hinge, living hinge, and so it allows flex there without getting stressed and cracking. But that's one of the most common things that you may see every day. Also polystyrene, number 6, that's your foam. It could be the drinking cups. A lot of food type packaging can be polystyrene. Typically, if you've got a clamshell, like buy fresh salad or fresh fruit from the supermarket or the deli, that can often be a polystyrene material. Typically, this is not recycled in the U.S. And then there's sort of the everything else category. That's not everything else. It's just what would be labeled as a number 7. Typically, that's the acrylics, polycarbonates, polyamides. From our perspective, being here at AMAP, polymer modifiers would not be classified in that category. This is more like consumer type materials. So because of all the different chemistry that's here, all of them have different processing temperatures, melting points, physical characteristics, and what may work for one may not work for another, especially from an asphalt modification standpoint. And because of that, if you start deselecting things that can be processed under normal asphalt conditions, you basically come to the conclusion, from our perspective, that not every plastic is potentially useful as an asphalt modifier. And just with the caveats here too is that this would be considering like a wet process, like how we mostly traditionally use polymers to modify. Also, no chemical treatment post-recycling, but just as is. And so polyethylene terephthalate has a melting point about 100 degrees C above compaction temperatures. PVC can potentially off-gas. Polystyrene has a high melt point. And then the others are a mixed stream. And because we really want to have a known modifier coming in, these get deselected. And so if we really start looking, well, what's the magnitude of these materials that are entering, the solid municipal waste, which would be your blue bin or your trash can that's going to the landfill, it gets broken out into some pretty big numbers. And so from the perspective of the polyolefins, which would be any polyethylene, polypropylene, you're looking at around 60% of the total stream going into landfill. Other makes up not quite a quarter of that, and then the rest is on the order of around a little over 10%. And if you further break down the polyethylenes, of that roughly 30% that enters the stream, it's a little bit higher for the low-density linear lows, a little bit lower for the high-density. But right now you're at 30% just for that polyethylene class. But so what does that mean to us? These are all plastomers. They have been used in the past. They may be used still in some locations with these as things to increase softening point, decrease penetration. Just because they're recycled isn't going to change the physical properties much, but they're plastomers from the perspective of how the organization here would see that. And so they're going to have all of those benefits of what a plastomer would introduce to modification. So depending on where you do your cutoff, if you put the cutoff at 135 C for compaction, you're looking at around 30% of the waste going in is potentially usable as an asphalt modifier. If you bump that temperature up a little bit and can incorporate polypropylene, we're up to around that 60% number. But we need to realize that plastomers often do little to no improvement in elastic properties. They can have poor intermediate low temperature performance, and they can phase separate and they can may be insoluble, causing some separation issues. So what's going on? You know, this is a global issue. I know some of the earlier talks that covered this topic alluded to the fact there's a lot of social media presence here. There's not a lot of details on technical projects that have incorporated recycled materials. From our perspective, Dow wants to be very transparent. So we look to the audience here as key stakeholders in the industry to coach or advise us on what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong. So later I'll have some technical data covering a couple of the field projects we've done, but really, you know, we want to know, are we doing the right thing or the wrong thing from a testing perspective before we go out and get too wild and crazy here. You know, we have to do good science. We have to demonstrate both from a health, a safety, and environmental perspective, these materials can be used properly. They have to deliver performance equivalent or better to what's out there now. And this is really critical because, you know, from the massive investment that goes into pavement, you know, we can't get this wrong. So we're very supportive of further research and really working with all of the key stakeholders that are here, you know, in order to prove this out. But just at a high level, just kind of what's been going on globally. This is just via Google search. Some of these projects are linked via an HTML in the training deck that was given on Tuesday. But just from North America, McGreever has looked at doing the dry process. They've had a pavement at UC San Diego. They've done a project or two in Canada. Asia has done quite a bit. Most of it has been dry processing. Fulton Hogan has looked at a section in Christchurch where they took high-density polyethylene, actually it was recycled plastic oil containers, and they paved out part of the pavement at their International Airport Fire Station. Downer has paved a suburban street, and what we really like to see is sort of metrics. In their section, which was 250 metric tons of mix, they used 50 metric tons of wrap, but then the modifiers were the equivalent of 200,000 plastic bags, 63,000 bottles, printer cartridges as the modifiers. McGreever's also had some projects in Australia. They're based out of Scotland, so they've had projects in the United Kingdom and South Africa. India has a specification to put 10% minimum recycled plastic in their pavements. I believe that is going to be modified moving into next year as they try to move to some performance-based specifications. And that's been exclusively dry process to my understanding, but they are trying to move to a wet process. And Shishalinga Construction had paved a small section outside of Durban with the high-density polyethylene. But just from a quick survey, this is what I gathered, worked with some things that may have had some details and actually had some news articles out there. I'm sure I've missed some, but wanted to cover this at a highlight. So really what's Dow doing? And as I said, we want to be transparent. We want to work with the key stakeholders here. We're looking at not requesting any specification changes for the projects we've tried to go into. These have been drop-ins. You know, we want the materials to work. I know the DOTs start getting heartburned every time a new material comes in and it's, hey, can you change the spec? But you know, there's a reason why we have specifications. There's a reason why the numbers are the numbers. We may not like them all the time and we can argue, but they're the reality, and we've gotten through the torturous path over the years, you know, to where the numbers do mean something. So we've had two projects I'll highlight. The Texas project, we paved a section at our Freeport manufacturing facility. That met a TxDOT PG70-22. The Michigan project, we paved some parking lots, some county roads as test sections, targeting Michigan DOT PG64-28. The goal here is to process on existing equipment, target field projects to generate data, take those samples to, you know, reputable test labs so that they can do their studies to tell us, is this a good idea or a bad idea? One of the things we've done is we've taken an RET with Elvaloy and trying to mitigate the plastomer performance gaps. And so the point of that service compatibilizer Buzz presented some data yesterday on the work that NCAT's done in that realm. We've been doing things in a parallel path. Our data, correlates very well with their binder test data. But that's been our spin is let's fix the gaps of these materials when they're used as plastomers. Let's put them elastomer in, meet DOT specs. So just a reminder of sort of what RET is. It's a reactive elastomeric copolymer. It has an epoxy functional group on it, a co-agent or co-reactant can be used as an epoxy hardener to chemically bond the polymer to asphaltene groups that are functionalized in the binder. Typically PPA is used at low amounts. There's other co-reactants out there that work also, but this is just a peripheral functionality in the bitumen that Elvoy typically will react with. You can thermally cross-link it. You can speed the reaction up significantly by linking everything together with a co-agent. In the lab, if quarter-gallon blends, after you have your polymer dissolved through low shear mixing, you add your PPA. In about 2 minutes, you can saturate your continuous grade and your phase angle. Here what we've done is the first thing we started looking at was the separation test, passing it. And so we know that high values typically indicate polymer incompatibility. And so if you start looking at this, if you look at the bottom here on the scale, the first number is the amount of weight percent plastic. The second number is the amount of the alveoli. And so here, the PCR samples had very high separation values. This was a low-density polyethylene that was from a clean stream, so it was exclusively that material. But you're looking at over 40 degrees C separation value. You look at the RET-only samples that were the controls, as expected at 1.8% dosage, 0.9 weight percent dosage. There's no separation. The combination of 1.5% plastic now and 3% we found had no separation also. So adding the RET here did compatibilize it, and it did solve the separation using this ASTM test. If you start looking at some of the optical microscope, just to sort of see what's going on, this is the binder only that did have some PPA in it at the start. As you expect, it's just smooth. There's no contrast from materials in there. Add the alveoli because it's a blend-in product and it reacts. It's also homogeneous. Looks very similar to the binder. This is 3% of the recycled polyethylene, and you start seeing domains that are large and visible. If you look at the dark field portion, you can see there's a very high level of contrast. And so the plastic is fluorescing very highly here. And then if you add the RET, you can see that the domains become much, much smaller. And so really there's no distinguishable difference between the RET only, the unmodified, and we did seem to improve, the micro domains of material here. And typically, 3% plastic is going to be on the very high side. Since we're trying to meet PG spec, that would be typically dosed down to lower levels. So looking at elastic recovery, because we do want to show that, that there is elasticity here, what we found was in these formulation ranges that I shared earlier, we were able to easily meet the PG70 -22 binder spec. The minimum requirement was 30%. Some blends were able to hit higher than 60% ER. Those would have met the PG82 -22 for TxDOT. So here we saw the similar trends as with separation, that the RET-only samples had high elasticity, 60 and 70% respectively for the 0.9 and 1.8% dosages. The PCR samples actually failed. They had no elasticity because they broke during elongation. And so here's just a side-by-side picture of the normal polymer modified in green and then the PCR only modified in red. Once you add the combination again, you do see an improvement that makes it more like the RET alone. And again, we're putting in 1.5% and 3% respectively of the recycled plastic. Phase angle, you see that here on the left, the mixed samples were about the average versus the PCR only, unmodified, or the RET only. On the right, we have 67C MSCR percent recovery. And again, it's about the average between the RET only and the PCR only. And so here you can see in the middle, that's the combination. One worry also is low temperature processing and low temperature performance. And so in all cases, we did meet S value. We're at borderline for the 3% recycled polyethylene only, but again, the trend here was when you start combining the RET only, you add the recycled polyethylene, it's about the average of the unmodified or PCR only versus the combination. So here, just to go through some case studies, basically we had the partners here were Martin Asphalt, American Materials, and Werner Construction, all based in South Texas. This 70-22 that was targeted, there was in this roughly 1 lane mile of project, there was 750 kg of material, recycled material used. And so this is an equivalent weight of around 120,000 plastic bags. So we did not use plastic bags in this, but just an equivalent weight. That's your single-use grocery bags that are really not single-use. Around 120,000 were used for a lane mile. We used 1.5% RPE, 0.6% alveoli, and 0.2% PPA. By incorporating the recycled material, we were able to cut the alveoli dosage by half. So overall, in this case, the binder was cheaper using the combined materials versus an elastomer only. This was a Type T mix design, 19% wrap, around 5% asphalt binder, and this was a limestone dolomite aggregate. In Michigan, the Clink Group produced the binder, Central Asphalt and Pyramid Paving did the hot mix, Fisher Companies did the construction. Winpack, which is a Dow customer, supplied the recycled material. This was a little bit different than what we did in Texas. This was a post-industrial recycled material, so industrial scrap. It was also a mixed stream. It was around 75% linear low density polyethylene. The remainder, around 25%, was an engineered polymer with a melting point above 185 C. So this was an example of a multi-layer food packaging material that is non-recyclable traditionally. If you would put this wrap in your blue bin goes to the landfill, not the recycling center, because it's considered a contaminant. We did pave 6 public roads here at 6 lane miles. Total around 30,000 square yards of parking lot. And because that was a little bit bigger project, we did use around 4,600 kilograms of this PIR. That was the equivalent weight of over 750,000 single-use grocery bags. We also paved a project at Saginaw Valley State at the end here, and the formulation was 1.2% recycled material, 1.2% alveoli. This was a Marshall mix design. There were a couple of different paving types that were used. The majority was a 12.5 millimeter mix, but there was a 4.75 millimeter sand mix that was used on one road as a thin lift. And this also introduced wrap. So if here basically we were putting in these new modifiers as drop-ins. None of these projects were tailored specifically here. They already were on the books. And we dropped in because we met this. You were targeting to meet the specification. This is the only data table I have, but just what we've got here is in the left series of columns are the TxDOT PG70 we targeted, and in the right column was the MDOT 64-22 we targeted. And so from a viscosity standpoint, we were well below the maximum for both materials. We passed the upper PG requirement, elastic recovery we passed, in both cases significantly higher than what the minimum was. From a separation standpoint, we did fail the field sample for the Michigan project, and we believe that's because of the mixed film. In this case, a mill was not used to process the polymer. It just was low shear mixing, and because of that, there was some particulate matter that was visible. We chose not to screen that out because it was there in the binder, and that's one hypothesis for why we were above the allowable separation test. Also looking at from the low temperature and the intermediate temperature, we passed both of those. So just showing pictures as we wrap up. This was the construction at the Texas project at our manufacturing site. The comments we heard from the hot mix supplier and the construction company were they were surprised in a good way. One thing they did note that there was an odor difference between the mix, and when they started thinking about it, there was no sulfur smell. There was no sulfur crosslinker here, and so that was absent. So they were smelling more of the neat binder compared to what they thought would have been in a PMA. Also, from a standpoint, there were some concerns, and we did work really closely with them around, who was going to clean their trucks if there was fouling. Was this going to get compacted the same? What was different? And the messaging that we heard from them, and there's an interview in Asphalt Pro magazine with Central Asphalt, but their words were this was boring. It wasn't any different than normal. Everything was good. But this was a 2-inch lift, looked the same, compacted the same. The Michigan projects were very distressed pavements. Here's just some snapshots. Most of them were rural. There was a mix of more farm type distresses. Some were neighborhoods and also farm type distresses, but you saw pretty much all the different types of failure modes in these pavements. Normally those would have been used a PPA only modifier, which is why we had that as the control in the data table. But here we did pave our global headquarters, around 30,000 square yards of surface. This was all done in about a day. Here's paving Mid-Bay County Line Road. This was a 2-inch overlay, two lane miles total, mix of traffic here. But you can see the distress level on down here on the unpaved section here that was being covered. But everything was boring, which we liked. There was no change. Here was a more residential road. This one did use a geomembrane between that was already spec'd in. This was part of a DEQ project in Michigan, and that was a requirement was to use the membrane. A cul-de-sac, another neighborhood road, and that's all I have. But thank you. If there's time, I'm happy to answer any questions. I'll leave that to the moderator. Otherwise, I'm here into the morning. If people have comments or want to reach out by email or call, we're happy to share more of the technical data, as I said, that was presented at TRB. So thank you.
Thank you, CJ. All right, you'll be around so people could ask you at the break.
Yep.